Join me in welcoming Brigadier General Kelvin Coppock. Hey, how are you doing today, Cal?
I'm doing just great, Steve. How are you today?
I am doing so well. I'm so excited about your book. I've been looking forward to it for a really long time. Been telling people about it for a little while now. Um, but first, before we get into the book, tell us a little bit about you and your background.
Okay, so I was born into a military family. My dad was in the Coast Guard, served in World War II on the USS South Dakota. Born in Pennsylvania, we moved around a little bit to New Jersey, then to Hawaii, then pretty much settled down in South Florida, where my dad retired. And I went to grade school and junior high school and high school there in the 1960s, which, as you know, is a turbulent time in the country. During that time frame, I received an offer from the Air Force Academy to apply to them to see if I could get an appointment. And as luck would have it, based upon my swimming credentials, probably my academic credentials to a degree, they accepted me. And in 1970, the summer of 1970, went off to the Air Force Academy. Uh, I'd never been to Colorado before, never been west before, other than going to Hawaii on the trip to Hawaii when we lived there. And so it was pretty much a shock to the system to go to the Air Force Academy in the 1970s. As you know, the Vietnam War was still going on at that point in time. A lot of Academy graduates were flying over in Vietnam at the time. Some were being shot down, captured. And so that was a very big influence during those early years at the academy because they were preparing us not only to get an education and to become second lieutenants in the Air Force, but preparing us for potentially going over into the war and being captured. And the summer programs were pretty rigorous at that point in time, and I'm sure they still are today. We went through a simulated prisoner of war camp environment during the summer programs that as a 17, 18-year-old were a very big shock to the system. But then getting through that first year and that first year and a half, things started to settle down a little bit and finished up my time at the academy, was able to get through. And unfortunately, my eyes had deteriorated and I was unable to go to any kind of flying training at that time, at least not directly. I probably could have asked for a waiver. So I chose missiles. ICBMs were interesting at the time. The Minuteman III had just come into being, and I was getting married. My wife wanted to stay in the Western United States, and that's where most of the missile bases were. So everything kind of lined up pretty good for me to go to missiles. And also at that time, one of the lures of going into missiles was the Minuteman Education Program, whereby the Air Force would schedule that as part of your normal duty. They would pay for the master's degree, and that would be part of your job would be to go to class. So all that lined up really nice, and I said, I think I will do that. Um, and we went off to Vandenberg Air Force Base in California for training, and then up to Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana for my initial assignment as a missile launch officer. From there, things just moved along through a career. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into with that, and ended up on September 11th, 2001, that I was the director of intelligence at Strategic Command in Omaha. On that day, we were undergoing the last day of a large nuclear exercise, an annual exercise that the Strategic Command and before that SAC would undergo to test the system, put a stress on the system, just to make sure when the real thing happened, you'd be prepared. And the morning of September 11th, we were in the last day of our exercise, which is when our adversary, fictional adversary for the exercise, would launch their nuclear weapons against the United States. We would then retaliate with ours. So everything was at a heightened state of readiness on that day, including having bombers loaded with nuclear weapons. Submarines were in their launch areas. ICBMs were ready to launch in a very short period of time. And this was on the morning of September 11th. The Doomsday planes, as they are sometimes called, E-4Bs, were launched as part of the exercise. And that led to some conspiracy theories because one of them flew over the White House, and CNN, I believe it was, had a video of it. And people were saying, well, why would they have these airplanes already launched if the United States didn't know that these attacks were going to take place? Of course, we did not know. Uh, and we had no inkling that attacks that morning. But we were prepared as Strategic Command because we were in the middle of the exercise. Our strategic forces were ready because we were in the middle of the exercise. So as the morning unfolded, we all were in the battle staff area and just started to participate in the conferences that were taking place with the National Military Command Center, with the Pentagon, with the White House, just trying to understand what was unfolding before our eyes. In that process, we had 8 large screens were up in the command center, and 2 of those screens we had NBC and CNN on. So we were getting information, really timely information from the news media than we were getting from our intelligence feeds. Because intelligence feeds take a little while to develop and to analyze. But even with the intelligence feeds, we weren't seeing anything. We weren't seeing anything from our adversaries' strategic forces. We constantly monitor them for movement of their troops, for increases in their communications, for changes in their leadership location as well. We weren't seeing any of that. So we had a pretty good idea that it was not a state actor that was causing the havoc that morning, but it was more terrorist related. Although at that point in time, we still didn't know what that terrorist relationship was. And we were fielding a lot of questions from the strategic forces. Like I said, we're in a high state of readiness. They kept calling us saying, what's going on? What do you know? What are we supposed to do? We kept them at that high state of readiness. The national decision makers decided to go to actual DEFCON 3, which actually really didn't do much for us because we were already at that heightened state of readiness. It just changed us from exercise now to real world. And as the morning unfolded, this continued until at Strategic Command until we got the notification that the president was coming to Offutt Air Force Base. So we really did not know that that was going to happen. He had stopped at Barksdale first to refuel the Air Force One, and then they took off again into the skies. He had taken a message there. That message was broadcast after he left Barksdale. Probably about 20 minutes out of Barksdale, 30 minutes out of Barksdale was when we were notified. When the CIA representative at Stratcom came to me and said, the president's coming here. And I kind of, had probably had a shocked look on my face. Like, the president's coming here. Okay, in a sense that made sense because we were in the middle of the country, obviously a secure location. We were in an underground facility, once again, secure. The thoughts at the time were where could he go to maintain his command and control of the nation and of our forces, and at the same time be safe. So clearly Offutt was one of those places. Cheyenne Mountain would be another one, as you know, deep in Granite in Colorado. But to do that, he'd have to land in an airfield and then be transported probably 45 minutes, an hour to the Cheyenne Mountain. So I think that's why they chose Offutt Air Force Base. The location, the secure underground, the communications capabilities. And as we were notified that he was going to be there, then we started to build an intelligence brief for him because across the world, all commanders, and the president included, the first thing they want when they get somewhere is an intelligence briefing. They want to know, what do you know? What's happening? What is the status? So we built the briefing for him. He landed. He came down to the underground. I gave him a presentation on what we knew and what we didn't know at the time. I had that information. All of the 3-letter representatives, the National Security Agency, the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, all had representatives at Strategic Command, and they were all part of my staff, and they were feeding me information. So we built a short briefing for him. He came in. I gave him the presentation. Then he joined into the conference, talking to the vice president, talking to the secretary of defense, talking to his national security advisor, and going through the status of what they knew and what they didn't know. At that time, it was still pretty much a dynamic situation. There were still a lot of aircraft that we weren't sure what their status was at the time. There were reports coming in all the time. Anything that was coming in became exaggerated. If there was something that was a little bit amiss with an airplane, with the communications, that became exaggerated because you really didn't know what the outcome of that particular event was going to be. Following his participation, his being President Bush's participation in the conference, then I took him up to a secure facility, video facility that we have, or that we had in Strategic Command, and that's where he joined his National Security Council. The National Security Council wants to restate some of the information I said here. The entire things were going to be all right. Yes, we'd undergone an attack. Yes, it was catastrophic. Yes, New York City, the plane in Pennsylvania, the Pentagon were attacked, but that we still had control of the nation, we still had control of our military forces, and that that he was in charge, and things were going to turn around and work in the right direction based upon the information he was receiving. But he wanted to show the nation that that they could feel secure about the future at that point in time. So once his National Security Council meeting was over, he said, "I'm going home," and he and his team left immediately. There was no hesitation. They went out and jumped in Air Force One and flew away. We at Strategic Command at the time then started to gather more information and determine the status of our strategic forces, so the nuclear forces, and what was going to happen to them as the rest of that day unfolded, and as more knowledge and events took place. It wasn't long after that we started to support Central Command in developing targets for what eventually was the going into Afghanistan. So Strategic Command kind of shifted at that point in time. Still had our focus on the strategic indicators: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, what was happening with them, but at the same time having our targeting cell support the Central Command in terms of helping them prepare for what they had to do in Afghanistan.
That is so amazing.
Anyway, that's kind of a long version there. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just so enamored with it. I mean, all of us remember where we were and what was going on that morning, and um, really interesting to hear all the stuff you guys are going through at that point. So the book is called Destination 9/11. Director of Intelligence on 9/11 speaks out for the first time. Is some of your ability to be able to speak about this just because time and things can be told that couldn't be told, and how much of it is just because it's the 20th anniversary and people are interested?
There's both. Part of it is because a lot of things in the last 10 years have become unclassified. They've been declassified, I guess is a better way to say it. And because they are now declassified, I was able to provide more insight into what was happening behind the scenes that day and in the events leading up to that day. Most of the conversations that occurred within the National Security Council or that President Bush had with his team were classified until just a few years ago. And because they are now unclassified, I was able to put those in the book with some context about what else was happening within the national scene and in the strategic forces scene. And of course, the 20th anniversary coming up kind of gave me a little bit of a nudge, that plus COVID and a little bit of time during COVID provided me that nudge to say, okay, if you're ever going to do this, probably now is the time to do it.
Absolutely. So, and of course, people got to get the book. In fact, I'm going to put the link in the chat right now if somebody didn't see it in the description. But because they want to read all of it. But is there anything that's kind of like, wow, that's really shocking that you share in the book that you can kind of tease us with?
Well, my intent was not to be shocking. I know that putting dirt on somebody or a salacious story sells, but I wanted to make this as neutral as possible in terms of just being factual as I understood what was happening at the time. I guess the biggest knowledge or the piece that people would not know would be one, that where we were with our strategic forces on that day, that we were involved in exercise, that there were nuclear weapons loaded, that had the president said, we're going to, and of course, if we would have had indications of a state actor and we wanted to make a military response, our military was on a high state of readiness that day. I don't know that people would know that already. Another piece that they probably, I would think, would have very little insight to was what happened in the community with the president, the vice president, the secretary of defense, when the president was at Strategic Command. What you normally would see on a news report is that the president landed at Offutt Air Force Base. They would have a video possibly of him walking down or coming into a very small brick building, which we called the mole hole or the rabbit hole, and then him leaving. And in the intervening hour and a half, 2 hours, there's nothing. There's nothing out there regarding that other than the president wanted to go back to Washington, D.C. The book provides some insight into the conversation that took place and what happened in the Strategic Command underground during that time frame.
So what is something that we know now that we didn't know then that we, as American people can do to be more prepared, to be, to learn from that horrible incident?
I think there are two things. One is that the indicators had been building over a period of time that may have given us a little bit of more insight into what was taking place. Of course, a lot of that came out in the 9/11 Commission about the training of the terrorists and their flight training and how they were learning to take off and fly, but never to land the airplanes. Those are indicators, but there are a lot of indicators out there. There are always a lot of indicators that it takes some luck. It takes a lot of analysis to put the right pieces of that puzzle together to try and stop something like 9/11 from happening. We see it all the time these days, where an individual just recently had a lot of armament in an area, and law enforcement goes in, they find it, they stop the individual, they collect the weapons that he had, and the event doesn't take place, but then the story goes away because the event did not take place. And that could have been a catastrophic event, like what happened in Las Vegas with the individual shooting from the hotel. Had he been stopped ahead of time, it wouldn't even have been a story. But the story occurs when it's not stopped ahead of time. And I think these happen every day. They happen every day in our law enforcement, who does a fantastic job stopping things from military, who's identifying potential catastrophic events and stop them. What gets the news is stopped. Of course, on 9/11, it wasn't stopped. So I think people should be assured and reassured that their law enforcement, their military, the FBI, are out there every day trying to prevent and are preventing catastrophic events from occurring.
I think that's a really good reminder because, I think a lot of times we don't take credit of all the things that are happening that we just don't know about, that are I mean, maybe someday it'd be declassified, but they really won't make a blip on the radar because who knows to look for, the terrorist event that didn't happen.
Correct.
Well, I am so
and there
excited.
Are a lot of those that are prevented.
Yeah. I am so excited about the book. I have really exciting news that I get to share with you live. Yesterday, the book actually made it as #1 in hot new releases. And this morning, it is already in the United States.
Oh, my goodness.
#1 in at least 7 categories that I found. And I'm still digging, so I'm sure there's more. But congratulations, you are now and will forever be a best-selling author. And we're still, of course, watching the international numbers as they come in as well.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you for letting me know that. That's surprising. I wrote the story, one, because it was a story that wasn't being told, but also for my kids and grandkids, because although they're with me for part of that, what we do in the military, a lot of time our families and our kids don't have a full understanding or knowledge or sometimes appreciation of what goes on behind the scenes, sometimes because it's classified, sometimes because we just don't share it very often. And I think we saw that a lot in any of the, from World War II to Vietnam to what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. The veterans come back and they don't share their stories. And there are a lot of stories out there, I think, that need to be shared. And I hope that they are shared, because our military, our veterans, we owe them a debt of gratitude, and their stories are compelling. This is a story, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of stories out there that are even more compelling than this one as to what they do every day. And I hope somehow, some way, those stories get a chance to be shared with the American public.
I do hope everybody will get their copy of Destination 9/11. General Coppock, I appreciate you spending some time with us here on the show today.
Thank you, Steve. My pleasure.